Thank you. Senator Kaine.
Thank you. Well, like many who've spoken today, I think the Dobbs decision was a disaster, both in terms of the human consequences of it, but also the radical nature of undoing not just 50 years of Roe versus Wade, but 100 years of 14th Amendment precedent that began with cases like whether parents should be able to make their own choices about whether their kids go to parochial schools or not. Should parents be able to make their own choices about educating their children to speak German? Should people be able to marry who they want? And the Supreme Court's decision to cast out not just Roe, but then jeopardize all of these other rights that we've taken for granted for a century has had just a set of horrible consequences. I think we need a national protection. I have a bipartisan bill that would protect both Griswold and Roe and restore to where we are pre-Dobbs and make plain that your rights shouldn't depend on what zip code you live in. Your rights shouldn't depend on who your state legislature is. The notion in Dobbs that the Supreme Court said, but don't worry, you can go to your state legislature, when most of the state legislatures in the country, I mean, look at Congress, it's 26% women. That's cold comfort to say women's rights. Well, you can just count on the legislature to do it, right? When women are so underrepresented in most of our legislatures, and that's why we have a Constitution. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights is designed to protect core freedoms. Even if the majority is against you, there's something that you should get living in this country, even if you're just one person, that the majority can't trample upon. Virginia, thank goodness, is one of the states, one of the few states that essentially still follow Roe. There was the basic framework established by Roe, minimal regulation of abortion pre-viability, some more significant regulation post-viability. That's where Virginia is. Not everybody likes that. For some, it's not enough. For some, it's too much. But Virginia has basically done that, and that has put Virginia in an unusual position because we're the last state in the South. The last state in the South that really still provides women and all the rights that Roe guaranteed to them for half a century. Ms. Lopez, you alluded to this in your testimony, but there's an unusual burden in these instances where states like Virginia are protecting reproductive freedom, but surrounded by others that aren't. There was a story in the Washington Post recently, and I mean, here's an example. A woman drove from Houston, Texas to Fort Lauderdale, an 18-hour drive to access reproductive care. She hadn't heard that the Florida 6-week ban had gone into effect. So with no other option and 9 weeks pregnant, she then drove an additional 12 hours to Virginia to receive care. And after she legally was able to terminate her pregnancy at 9 weeks, she then had a 17-hour drive home back to Texas. It's just, I think, outrageous that we're making people do that. But talk a little bit about the burden with this patchwork of, some states protecting women's reproductive freedom and many states not.
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for the question. And as I stated in my testimony, now 1 in 5 abortion seekers are traveling outside of their state to places like Virginia to seek care.
And you said it was 160,000.
Yeah.
80,000 before Dobbs, 160,000 since.
Yeah. And so, and what we know is that, that increases in places like your state for our providers, that increases the number of patients they're getting. So both the residents that they're serving within their own state and now this influx of patients, which means that there's going to be an increased waiting time. So if you think about all of the barriers that someone having to leave their home community, figure out how they're going to pay for the procedure, take off work, find childcare, because most people who seek abortion are also parents themselves, go to an unfamiliar place, probably have to wait, and then also have costs on the ground. The financial, logistical, and ultimately the emotional barriers are ridiculous and sometimes insurmountable, and ultimately could be forcing some people to carry pregnancies to term.
And then finally, this is a hearing that is about how abortion bans have created a healthcare nightmare. That's the title of the hearing, but the Dobbs decision also impacted a whole lot of other rights. Again, this whole 14th Amendment jurisprudence since the mid-19-teens, including the right to contraception. In Virginia, because of the logic of the opinion, Virginia legislators, Sia Price and Ghazala Hashmi, 2 friends of mine in the Virginia General Assembly, introduced a contraception protection in Virginia law that was passed overwhelmingly by the legislature, but our governor vetoed it. Are you seeing other states, taking the green light of Dobbs to put into question contraception in vitro, other important healthcare services.
Absolutely, Senator. Not just contraception, but efforts to defund Planned Parenthood continue, to limit or defund Title X, access to contraception for everyone, other restrictions on minors' access to care, IVF, and then we're also seeing, kind of similar efforts around transgender and gender-affirming care. Those are all interrelated and all efforts to limit access to basic reproductive health care.
Well, just as I conclude to my colleagues, Elizabeth Carr, the first child born via IVF in the United States, was born in Virginia in 1981, and I had her as my guest at the State of the Union. And she said when the Alabama Supreme Court rendered the ruling that then led the Alabama healthcare providers to stop IVF, she said, for the first time in my life, I felt like an endangered species. No one should be made to feel that way. Thank you. I yield back.